Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Anne-Sophie Corbeau. I am a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy at Columbia SIPA. So today we are going to discuss understanding the potential of carbon negative hydrogen, and it seems that this is something which is particularly interesting because we had about 800 people registering for that webinar. This event is webcast live, and the full video is going to be available in the coming days. For those of you who are joining us online, you can ask a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Also, all our events are closed captioned, so you can turn the caption on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting Show Subtitles. It seems that we are talking a lot about hydrogen, but mostly about hydrogen as a way to reduce carbon emission. There is another thing which is very important, which is to remove carbon emission. And this is why we need to talk also about removing emissions with hydrogen. And this is what we are calling carbon negative hydrogen. I am very, very pleased that I am joined today by three panelists. Gary Grimm, who is scientist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Marina Pastoris, who is Technical and Project Officer at the European Biogas Association, and George Stolaroff, CEO at MOT. All of them have different experiences with carbon negative hydrogen, ranging from association, research, but also practical development of the technology. What is also good is that we are straddling two continents, Europe as well as North America, so they will give you some slightly different regional perspectives about that technology and why people should be interested in that. Because whether I am looking at European legislation, US legislation, it has not been quite completely included. And I think this is why we also need to bring that to the attention of policymakers. But I'm already talking too much. So without waiting, I am going to give the floor to Gary, who is going to give us maybe a little bit more definition about what we mean by carbon negative hydrogen technologies, but also give us a highlight about what is happening in the United States. Gary, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Anne-Sophie, and thank you to all of you for attending today. I'm very excited to present at this seminar. So, to lead off here, what I'd like to do is spend a few moments talking about what exactly do we mean by carbon negative hydrogen, and then I'll expand on how we view carbon negative hydrogen at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So when we talk about carbon negative hydrogen, what we're really meaning is two things. We're producing hydrogen and simultaneously we're sequestering or in some form storing carbon dioxide. So an often cited example is starting from a waste carbonaceous feedstock like 1 ton of biomass. In this case, carbon dioxide is being pulled from the atmosphere via a photosynthetic process and stored in the form of biomass. And then by applying energy and material inputs such as heat, electricity, water, we can deconstruct that biomass into some amount of hydrogen and some amount of carbon dioxide that can then be sequestered or stored. So when we use the phrase carbon negative hydrogen, what we mean is that the entire process from cradle to grave has a carbon intensity score of less than 0. The actual carbon intensity score is going to depend on a myriad of different parameters surrounding the land use, the cultivation of the feedstock, the conversion of the feedstock, the downstream purification and separation schemes. But one of the commonly cited values amongst literature for biomass gasification combined with carbon capture and storage is a value of around minus 14 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hydrogen, meaning the more hydrogen we produce in this manner, the more carbon dioxide we're drawing down from the environment. So at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here in the US, some of the key questions that we're thinking about regarding carbon negative hydrogen are first around its value proposition. So we're asking ourselves the question of, can we turn some of the world's worst carbon emitting processes like ammonia synthesis, steel manufacturing, can we turn them into net carbon sinks using carbon negative hydrogen? On the other hand, we're asking ourselves the question, is there a unique value to integrating hydrogen production with carbon dioxide removal? So if you think about globally, hydrogen production is gaining a lot of traction around the world, primarily using renewable electricity to split water via an electrolysis process to get to like a carbon neutral sort of hydrogen. Simultaneously, there's efforts going on to use direct air capture to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it geologically. So those are two unit operations that are accomplishing essentially the same goal as a integrated carbon negative hydrogen process. So we're seeking to investigate what the value add is by combining these or doing a process intensification. And finally, we're trying to ask the question of, if we could pull this off, what would be the impact, domestically and abroad to our CO2 emissions profile? Further to that point, we're also looking at identifying what are the key near-term technologies that could enable the production of carbon negative hydrogen. And more specifically, an area that I'm actively working in is understanding better how might that toolkit of pathways or technologies, how might that evolve over time? Are the technologies that we're talking about today going to be the same technologies in 2040, 2050? Or are there other emerging technologies that we should be thinking about? And what are the R&D challenges associated with those technologies? And finally, we're always very cognizant or aware of some of the challenges around utilizing carbon negative hydrogen, specifically when it comes to feedstock availability. I alluded to earlier, one of the primary feedstocks that is considered typically for carbon negative hydrogen is waste biomass. Others are like municipal solid waste. There are many other organic streams that are under consideration. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there may be some limitations around the availability of these quote unquote sustainable resources when there are other demand cases out there, such as sustainable aviation fuel, other transportation fuels, decarbonizing the chemicals industry. So we're trying to better understand the supply and demand dynamics for sourcing the feedstocks to make the carbon negative hydrogen. Also, as is with the case for a lot of the emerging, more sustainable practices being developed around the world, we often find that it can be expensive to make products or fuels that have a low carbon intensity. So we're trying to better understand what the regulatory environment is like that could enable carbon negative hydrogen and what the needs might be to really drive it into the marketplace. And finally, we're also considering what the infrastructure and transmission needs might be to deliver hydrogen from the various feedstock locations to ultimately the end users. The final thing that I'd like to add this morning is looking at kind of a US-centric value proposition, where if you look at how the United States is consuming hydrogen today, we find that it's on the order of about 10 to 11 million metric tons of hydrogen per year. And it's concentrated primarily in three sectors: petroleum refining, ammonia synthesis, and methanol synthesis. Now, if we look at how hydrogen is consumed today, it's primarily from the reforming of fossil hydrocarbons. If you look across the literature, that typically will have an average carbon footprint of about a positive 10 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for every kilogram of hydrogen that's produced. So that would mean that domestically here in the United States, our hydrogen consumption is equating to about 110 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emitted into the atmosphere every year. However, if we were to hypothetically just make the assumption that overnight, all of our hydrogen consumed in the United States was instead produced via this carbon negative hydrogen process, using that negative 14 number that I quoted earlier for biomass gasification with CCS, our back of the envelope math suggests that this hypothetical scenario could result in a net removal of about 150 million metric tons of CO2 per year domestically. So when you combine the ability to avoid the emissions from fossil hydrogen production, combined with the net drawdown of a carbon negative hydrogen process, in sum total, we see that across the current markets in the United States, this would represent about 1/4 of a gigaton of CO2 equivalent removal compared to current business as usual in the United States. So this would represent theoretically about a 5% drawdown in our domestic emissions in the United States. But I also think it's important to point out that the market size for hydrogen is expected to expand dramatically over the next couple of decades, with some estimates suggesting our domestic consumption could reach 20 to 40 million metric tons per year, which would, of course, enhance this decarbonization potential. So I want to stop here, and I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Gary. I mean, that was particularly interesting, and I think it's very important to put the numbers in context. So what is the current US hydrogen demand? What could we do? But also, what is a business case in terms of carbon emissions removal, and where could we get? Of course, the question people may ask, but is that doable to have only these kind of technologies meeting that demand that you quoted could be as much as 20 to 40 million tons of hydrogen by 2050. I think I want to go closer to home for me, towards Europe, and give the floor to Marina Pasteris. I think it's also important to know that the European Biogas Association has published a few months ago a report which was really dedicated to biohydrogen and how it looks like in Europe. So Marina, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and Sophie, for the nice presentation. I hope you can see my slides. As you said, at the European Biogas Association, together with our members, we prepared a biohydrogen paper. And this was the motivation behind was that in Europe in general, we don't find, at least as long as we know, clear definition for biohydrogen, and that also includes the framework, so the policy framework. So it was important to speak up, and this is what we've done. So I'm bringing in some insights of that. Again, my name is Marina Pasteris, and I'm a technical and project officer at the European Biogas Association. I will quickly talk about the association because it's important to understand how we work. So we call ourselves, actually also our members, that we are the voice of renewable gases in Europe. So we are covering the whole value chain of biogas and biomethane principally. But you can see the different logos of our members. Between the members, we have different types of companies, and they are not only producing biogas or biomethane, but they are also producing other types of renewable gases. And that includes, of course, biohydrogen and biogenic CO2 and, other co-products as well. So our work is divided in different 6 thematic areas. And we have different working groups at the EBA, and this paper was a result of a specific task force called Biohydrogen from the Technology and Innovation Working Group. The paper was released on the 14th of June this year, and it's freely available in our website. So if you are interested, you can go and check it there. So we have included in this paper 6 different chapters. First, we are covering hydrogen in general, so an overview of hydrogen in Europe. Then we go more into biohydrogen, the different technologies, the sustainability of the production of biohydrogen, some aspects about economics, and the potential markets of biohydrogen, which are actually same as other types of hydrogen, and then also an analysis of the policy framework with some recommendations. Going more into the insights of this paper, we first have to mention that we are proposing a definition for biohydrogen, and that so we said that biohydrogen refers to hydrogen obtained from biogenic sources, and that, for example, could be biogas or biomethane. That's where we enter, but also some other biomasses. And we can use different types of technologies for this. We want to be recognized as part of the green hydrogen from a legal point of view, together with the hydrogen that is coming from non-biological origin. So in this table, you can also see that some other products that we can bring are, for example, digestate or biochars, or also biogenic carbon dioxide. So one of the unique characteristics of biohydrogen is that it can be carbon negative. As you can see in this table and the table on the top, the different carbon footprints. This is thanks for the Columbia University paper. Also, we are adapting from the data published by them. We can see that biohydrogen can actually have a negative carbon footprint. We can achieve negative emissions if, for example, we are coupling the different biohydrogen production technologies with carbon capture and storage, or if we are producing the biohydrogen from different feedstocks like manure or other wastes. But for some of the biohydrogen production technologies, we can see in the table below that the technology readiness level is not very advanced, but for others it is, like the biomethane steam reforming or biogas steam reforming. And actually, we already have some examples between our members that this is possible, and they are producing biohydrogen. Also, well, what we need actually from for biohydrogen to reach the market, it's basically or primarily an European policy framework that is also covering biohydrogen. And we have identified, you can see here, 3 main barriers. The first one is about the lack of market access, because actually it's related to the failure to recognize biohydrogen. There is no clear definition, and therefore we cannot have access easily to the gas network. There is a lack of price signals through taxation, and that also includes all types of hydrogen. And also there is insufficient and discriminatory consumption targets, for example, in the Renewable Energy Directive 2 and its revision number 3. So we recommend that the European legislation adopts the biohydrogen definition that we are proposing, and then it expands the targets for other types of hydrogen to also biohydrogen, and revise all the other directives in accordingly to this. So, but if you want to know more, I invite you again to go to our website or reach to me in any case with questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you for giving this relatively comprehensive view about what is happening in Europe, but also talking about something which for people who are on the other side of the Atlantic is mostly about regulation, because we are quite advanced in terms of regulation in Europe. We are talking about this RED-free and about renewable fuel of non-biological origin, but also about many things which actually are coming slowly to the American side, especially in the current discussion about the IRA. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Georges Solarov, who is the CEO of MOT, and he's going to give us probably a little bit more practical view about somebody who is trying to put that in practice. So Georges, what is your perspective on carbon negative hydrogen?
Yes, thank you. So I'm Josh Solarov. I'm the CEO of MOT, and let me show you a little bit about where we're at. So in very basic background, we take woody wastes and gasify them to make hydrogen that is fuel cell grade and CO2 that is pipeline grade for geologic storage. And the kinds of waste that we can use are come from three broad categories: agricultural residue, forest residue, like small brush, small trees and brush from fire management, and urban green waste, yard trimmings, pallet wood, construction demolition wood. All those things can be gasified. And once we gasify them, we have a proprietary integration of downstream processing equipment to split them into hydrogen and CO2 streams. We're a climate technology startup. We're spun out of work that I did with a lot of colleagues at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and in specific, the two reports pictured in the upper right. We're 6 people, 3 years old, so fairly new, but we've made a lot of progress in this time. This is a rendering of our first plant that we expect to build near Bakersfield in California. And just to give you a sense of what's going on here, this is a wood yard. These are rows of wood chips in piles. This is 1 month of feedstock storage. Here is the gasification island. We have gas processing here, gas storage. These are truck turnarounds for hydrogen trucks and biomass trucks, evaporation ponds so that we can have zero water discharge. So this facility is meaningful scale in carbon removal terms. 400,000 tons per year is pretty meaningful. And also in hydrogen terms, 60 tons per day is pretty substantial, especially in clean hydrogen. 900 tons a day of biomass input is similar to a 50 megawatt power plant. So it's significant, but it's pretty manageable in terms of the biomass logistics system that we have in California and a lot of parts of the world. And to reiterate, we're taking a low risk technology approach, and you saw the various technologies and TRLs in the last presentation. So gasification is among the highest. And we're trying to take a technology that is old and mature for other applications and integrate it in a new way. And so we're using a commercially deployed gasifier and a lot of other equipment from oil and gas and from gas processing. And then we put that together with a biomass feedstock supply chain that is well developed, especially in California, for bioenergy plants. And then using CO2 storage projects that are already in motion for other applications. So we don't do our own geologic CO2 storage. We partner for that. We have 2 facilities in development. They're both in California. We have a lot of great partners for each of them. Different commercial markets and commercial partners for the CO2 storage, for hydrogen offtake, et cetera. And we have a lot of good grant support from the state and federal governments that helps make this first of a kind type of project go. And with that, happy to take questions. I'll keep this brief.
Thank you, Josh. Indeed, that was very brief. So, I mean, I really like, your picture with also the numbers, because, it gives a little bit of sense of reality about, what it means in terms of the production, but also how much biomass is really needed. And, I think sometimes people need to have an understanding about the reality on the ground. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us today for this webinar. So just as a reminder, I am joined today on this webinar about understanding carbon negative hydrogen technologies by Gary Grimm from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, Marina Pasteris from the European Biogas Association, as well as Josh Stolarov from Mote. Questions are open, so you can put questions in the Q&A below. I can see that a lot of questions have arrived in the last 2 minutes, so this is really excellent. Please do continue. Some of the questions will be answered directly either by our panelists or by Yushan, my colleague, who is also helping me during this webinar. But I would like to also, start a little bit of a discussion between our three panelists. Gary, I mean, you are really focusing on the United States, and I think, some of your colleagues were really saying there has not been enough attention to carbon negative hydrogen. So what are some of the near-term needs for bringing carbon hydrogen to the market in the United States? I mean, and what is your organization doing about that or thinking about doing?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Well, I think we've heard from our prior two panelists here that there are some technologies out there today that are, high TRL, ready to go, being commercialized. So, aside from maybe minor technical development issues, what we're looking at is how we can better understand the analysis side of carbon negative hydrogen. So what I mean by that is, intrinsic to what we're talking about is this idea of being carbon negative. So it all boils down to, how the life cycle of everything from the feedstock to the end product is being handled and treated. And our view is that there needs to be more work on that side of things to harmonize the assumptions, being used not only in the United States, but, around the world, so that we're all speaking the same language. And so that the analysis for the production of carbon negative hydrogen is meaningful and translatable across the pond. And I think this really bears fruit and is important because we're seeing that, a lot of these carbon negative hydrogen products can be reliant on, policy drivers, incentives, and those can be tethered to the degree by which you are carbon negative. So we would like to understand, those dynamics a little bit better, but also we're thinking about, in terms of near-term challenges or R&D, how are these things going to be cited? What are the logistics around citing for feedstock availability, co-location with end users or markets, while also being able to sequester or store the CO2 effectively. So we're looking at, at least with a US focus, where it might make sense to have all three of these parameters cited simultaneously.
So you mentioned, the need to talk the same language. I completely agree. I mean, but there was a specific question about how are you calculating the life cycle emission? Are you using GREET or are you using another benchmark?
Yeah, the answer is it kind of depends. With a DOE focus, oftentimes we are beholden to the GREET methodology. I think Josh could probably speak to this better than I, but I believe, in California, for example, a lot of their, policies like the low carbon fuel standard and whatnot are tethered to how GREET is evaluating a given process. So I think that's typically our standard on a lot of federal projects, but we also, try to benchmark those data against, commercially available databases like EcoInvent or what you might find from like a SEMA Pro sort of platform, just to make sure we're, in the same ballpark.
Okay, I see that we have a lot of questions, like technical questions for Josh, including how much water does the mud process use? What is the waste product of the mud process? Some questions about the LCOH. I don't know whether you want to talk about that. And maybe a question, for both Josh and Gary, which is about the hydrogen tax credit in the US. Okay, you can use 45V, but basically, and you can use also the 45Q for CCUS. So, how do you combine that? And actually, in the current version of the IRA, there is nothing for something which is below zero. It starts, it starts between 0 and 0.45. So maybe I start with Josh about all the technical questions, and I come back to Gary.
Sure. So the technical things, the beauty of gasification in this case is that almost all of the carbon ends up as CO2. So we have a little fly ash from the gasifier. We can sell that as a soil amendment. The waste stream is fairly minor from the process. And the water use, there is some water use, not as much as electrolytic hydrogen. And that's something we hope we can improve with improving technology. On the credits and the cost of hydrogen, so our projections and the Livermore report and some other reports out there show that the hydrogen from biomass gasification can get to $2 a kilogram or less with very low costs of carbon removal too. So the long term looks very good. First of a kind costs are higher, but then we do have a bunch of incentives to make that happen. So yes, in the US, we have a policy gap where there are incentives for clean hydrogen. And for us, the 45E clean hydrogen credit is more valuable than the 45Q carbon storage credit. So we choose that one. And yes, you don't get any benefit for going below zero in carbon intensity. And that's a problem going forward. But there are two markets where you can. One is the California low carbon fuel standard. So not a coincidence that we're starting in California. And the other is private carbon removal markets. So that's what we have to leverage to get started. But definitely going forward, we need a policy framework that understands carbon negative hydrogen, which at the federal level we don't have yet. And I expect Gary might have opinions on that too.
Yes, I would like to give the floor to Gary and then to Marina for about the same question. I mean, is there something missing? You mentioned the RFNBO, which is not taking into account, the kind of biohydrogen that you are mentioning. So what can we do about that? So first, Gary, and then Marina for some European perspective.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think I would probably echo a lot of what Josh had already said, but hydrogen is becoming a big deal within the United States. Within the past year or two, I believe the numbers I saw this morning where there's been over $10 billion pledged for building out the domestic hydrogen production capabilities across the United States. It's highlighted by the Department of Energy's recent what they call hydrogen shot target of getting down to $1 per kilogram hydrogen in 1 decade or by 2030. Just I believe yesterday, our President Biden was announcing some locations for our regional hydrogen hubs, where we're going to be rolling out these facilities across the United States to speed up the development of hydrogen production, infrastructure, and those sorts of things. But yeah, to the point about incentives, Josh is totally spot on. To my knowledge, there is no regulations in place where you can combine the 45Q and the 45V. So you really have to choose one or the other. And at this time, there isn't a direct incentive for going below zero. You can get the $3 per kilogram incentive put forth by the IRA, just getting to carbon neutral, even slightly above carbon neutral. So I see that as a near-term headwind for some of these, the rollout of carbon negative hydrogen until we can, truly incentivize going below zero. But as Josh touched on, there are alternative markets where, that can be accounted for.
So that's very interesting. I mean, there have been a lot of discussions in the United States about, additionality, temporal matching, really focusing on renewable hydrogen. There hasn't been a lot of voices saying, what about carbon negative hydrogen? Only, the IEA in the report that they published in April about we need to move away from the colors, which is very good, by the way, and we need to start talking about carbon intensity of hydrogen. They mention the carbon negative hydrogen. So there is definitely a lot of needs to raise that, or increase the attention to policymakers on this specific topic. Marina, how are you feeling about what is happening in Europe? Because in Europe, we talk about renewable hydrogen. Where is carbon negative hydrogen?
Yes, indeed. Even recently, and it was already approved by not only the European Commission, I think it's already in the Parliament, the REPowerEU plan that has the target of 20 million tons of hydrogen in Europe by 2030. So 10 from domestic production and 10 from imported. But it's all about hydrogen that is not from biological origin. And this is what we are missing in all the legislation everywhere. If you consider biohydrogen, if you want to look for it in the legislation, today it's under what would be also biogas or biomethane, which is, it's a bit different. If you consider, for example, the pipelines, we are a bit far from hydrogen pipelines. So therefore, the support that the biohydrogen production or the biohydrogen sector has is quite low. And that also includes research, financial support. We are part of different research projects also at DBA, and some of our members as well. But they come like from different financing sources, so it's not easy. So if we want to really scale up these technologies and go to the market, we need legislative support, definitely. And that starts with the definition, a clear definition. So this is how I see.
Thank you. There are some questions about the whole sustainability angle. So there is a limited pool of biomass. I think, Gary, you mentioned that, Marina as well. So, I mean, is that sustainable? And maybe also, we highlighted in the report that we published at the very beginning of the year that there are different types of biomass. So not everything should be used. Maybe the three of you can comment on that. So Marina first, and then Gary and Josh about the biomass and the sustainability of the biomass sources.
Yes, of course. We have the legislation that defines what is sustainable and what is not. And of course, as well as the biohydrogen, the biogas and the biomethane, the biohydrogen will have to comply with that sustainability criteria. That means coming from some sort of feedstocks and not others. And actually, the potential is big. So in Europe, I think from manure, at least, we are using only 10% of what is there. So what we need actually is more mobilization of the feedstocks. And you might say, okay, as European Biogas Association, you are advocating for biogas, biomethane, and biohydrogen might seem like a competitor. But actually, we believe in the mixture of solutions for the future. And the good thing is that this can be flexible and adaptable to different regions. So whenever we have an excess of sun and we can produce hydrogen from electrolysis, then we can store it maybe as methane, biomethane. And whenever we have a lot of manure and there is a need of hydrogen, then we can obtain biohydrogen, for example, there. So the key would be the technology development, the flexibility of the system, and the legislative framework supporting that.
Gary?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, I think life cycle analysis is a critical aspect to this. The whole name of the game is getting carbon negative. So, I think moving forward, feedstocks like that we would truly consider as wastes, like forest residues, Josh can touch on that a little bit more, but municipal solid waste, anything that isn't produced on purpose, I think is going to be advantageous. When we start talking about the on-purpose production of energy crops, various sources of biomass, that's when it really gets a little bit muddied when you're talking about, okay, what's the land use? What's the counterfactual example of what was the alternative that we could have done with that piece of land? So it gets really, to me, a little bit muddied on, exactly how you perform that analysis. And again, why I touched on, life cycle methodology harmonization as being a critical need moving forward. But I think over the near term, feedstocks that are truly wastes that otherwise wouldn't have had a value, or in the case of like manure, where you could make the argument that there's going to be fugitive emissions of methane to the atmosphere, doing something with those feedstocks, I think really helps on the life cycle side.
And Josh, maybe you can complement on that and also answer the question. I mean, there is a question about, is the biomass gasification eligible for carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market?
Yes. And I would also like to add on to the sustainability question a bit.
Please, absolutely.
So there are two paradigm shifts that it took to get to the place where Moat is. And they both happened when we're at Livermore. One is that biomass is more valuable as carbon removal than as energy. And that for millennia, we used biomass for energy, but in this current world where we need to take CO2 out of the air, it turns out the service that plants are doing of taking CO2 out of the air is harder to replicate than turning sunlight into energy. And when we run the economics, generally, in most cases, Moat gets most of our value from the carbon removal or the negative part of the hydrogen than from the hydrogen, though both are important. And the second paradigm shift was there's enough waste and residue to make a meaningful impact on carbon removal. In California, we found that you could meet the majority of California's needs with biomass waste and residues. And this just wasn't a way that we thought about biomass before. We're used to fighting about purpose-grown crops and the competition between food and energy, especially in the US. It's been a lot about corn ethanol. But we don't have to do that. There is enough waste and residue for, we calculate, 1,000 Moat plants in the US. So yes, these issues are important and we should consider them, but they're a ways down the road. So Moat recently released a sustainability statement, and our principles are fairly simple. One, we use only waste and residues. Two, we maintain chain of custody for all the biomass that we receive. So it has a tag. It says where it came from and who transported it. And that allows us to calculate the third part, which is life cycle. So it includes transport emissions. It includes the counterfactuals, which are usually minor for waste and residues. And we have to use life cycle because the regulatory frameworks do. So I just wanted to say, yes, there are issues with sustainability, but we're a long ways for gasification. We're a long ways from running into significant problems. Not that you don't have to think about it and have regulations that care about that stuff, but it's okay. And to the other question, yes, we can get private carbon removal credits, and the private markets really care about all that sustainability stuff.
Absolutely. And there is also a question that I think anybody can answer. Is there an advantage of converting the biogas to biohydrogen versus converting or combusting directly the biogas or the biomethane in a power plant with carbon capture? So, what is the pathway? Okay, Josh, you are looking. Is there anybody who feels comfortable? I mean, I think it's really a question of pathway, maybe in terms of, what is the best LCA or what is the best cost at the end of the day? What is the interest for the end user?
I think I can answer that if I understood the alternative pathway. Could you just say again?
So either you are using biogas to biohydrogen and then you are capturing the CO2, or you are taking the biogas, you are burning that in a power plant, and then you are using CCUS at the end. So you are not going through biohydrogen in the second one. You are burning the biogas or the biomethane directly in a power plant.
Yeah. My opinion is if your end goal is electricity, then you should burn the biogas. But electricity is a dumb thing to make from biomass.
Marina, I see
Germany, say that to Germany, for example, that is, I don't know, 12,000 plants are producing electricity. But it's again, I don't, it's a bit vague to say, but it really depends on the case. For now, of course, the biogas and biomethane technologies are mature, and there is a whole sector and even increasing each year. So if you go this way today, that would be easier, let's say. So you can already obtain a lot of electricity. But if there is, for example, a place where there is an excess of sun, and then you can convert easily or cheaper or obtain hydrogen in another way, I mean, it might not be suitable. So it depends on what is the product you are searching for and the local market, indeed.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions about CO2 or CCS sequestration, and I think maybe you can give different perspectives on that. I mean, first of all, there is a question about, we've heard a lot about CCS in the past, but so far there is not that much CCS which is under construction. That might be changing now with the IRA. And also a technical question for Josh. I mean, how far away is your storage site compared to your facility? So maybe I start with you, Josh, about the technical question, and Gary and Marina, you have time to think about, is CCS starting to be a reality in respectively the US and Europe?
Sure. As CCS is developing in the US, we don't have a lot of CO2 pipelines, and they're hard to build, especially in the US. So for Moat, the strategy is build a plant on top of the CO2 storage site.
Okay.
Especially in California, you avoid the contentious pipeline construction part as much as you can. In the future, I think that will shift, because on the pure cost basis, the CO2 transport is not as expensive as the hydrogen transport.
So that's a very interesting consideration. Maybe Gary, on the development of CCUS in the United States?
Yeah, so I think it's coming along slowly. In addition to the hydrogen hubs that I talked about earlier, I think the United States is also has set in motion the development of regional DAC hubs, so direct air capture. So we are starting to see some momentum building for collection of CO2 and where that might be stored ultimately. But I also want to point out that while it might not be the best scenario, we do have some CO2 capture and storage infrastructure already in place in the United States for enhanced oil recovery. So oil companies are well adept at injecting CO2 into depleted reservoirs to increase production of hydrocarbons. So maybe from a life cycle perspective, not great, but that sort of infrastructure is in place in some regions of the United States in the know-how.
And also, I mean, do you think, since you are talking about that direct air capture, is there, a policy challenge in the United States for co-locating DAC facilities with hydrogen production facilities?
Is there a challenge around that?
Yes, a policy challenge. That's a question.
I'm not well-versed enough to probably answer that, but I think you would look at the opportunities independent of one another and just see where it makes sense.
There is an arcane way that's difficult, which is the 45Q, 45V credit. If you did hydrogen and CO2 and DAC in the same facility, you might not be able to do both. Separate them and you can. But other than that, I think you usually would help to be both close to the CO2 storage.
You're mentioning the fact that we cannot combine or add up 45Q and 45V, which is, in the current IRA legislation. Maybe that will change. We don't know. Maybe the IRS is going to decide differently, but for the moment, this is the case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marina, CCUS in Europe has been facing a lot of headwinds. I think it's starting to change a little bit, but do you have to basically locate, like Josh, your biohydrogen facility on top of a storage site?
I'm not sure. I mean, we also published a biogenic CO2 paper within the European Biogas Association, and there we discussed this. I think the developments are under in a process. We might not be there yet, but we know at least for CCU, there are at least 15% of the biomethane plants already existing in Europe, and the ones that are coming more and more are planning to have or are having the capture of the biogenic CO2 coming from after the upgrading of the biogas for its use, for example, in methanation together in combination with hydrogen, and then they are producing more methane, or they are just using this CO2 in different, even in food and beverages. So this is what I know, at least on this of the sector. More I cannot say.
So basically what you are telling me is that in Europe, we are avoiding a little bit the storage for the moment, which is kind of consistent with what I've heard, because then you need to transport the CO2 somewhere. And then, I mean, in Europe, we tend to prefer having, the CO2 stored offshore rather than onshore. So that's kind of consistent. Yes, or use indeed. And this is very interesting that you are mentioning using that CO2 to produce then synthetic methane and basically loop the cycle. There are also a lot of questions about, okay, so you have produced your hydrogen, but then what do you do with that hydrogen? Both in terms of how do you physically transport the hydrogen to the end user, but also what kind of end user right now would be interested in that biohydrogen? So maybe, Marina, I start with you, given that in Europe, we have been talking a lot about transporting hydrogen somewhere. And then I come to Josh and Gary for the US specificities.
Yes, there is even the European hydrogen backbone with this whole project of pipelines of hydrogen through Europe. And it's still a project. So, but hydrogen in general, it's stepping. So it's gaining a lot of strength in Europe. So I think that will be, what did they say? By 2030 ready. So yeah, it seems we are moving there, but we still need to work. Did I miss the second part? I cannot recall the second part of the question.
I was asking about basically transporting it. So what kind of transport options, and also whether the end user is ready to accept, or, I mean, is there interest in biohydrogen specifically from the end user side?
Yes, sorry. What I wanted to mention is the blending of hydrogen into the natural gas grid. We know this it's happening in some places in Europe. Some would say it's not the best, and actually you cannot put a lot of hydrogen in the natural gas grids. But yeah, it's something that it's also happening. And from the end users, at least the ones that we know and that are related to consumption, well, when there is local production of biohydrogen, they tend to use it, and they are interested. But so far for biohydrogen, it's not possible to produce in huge amounts. So yeah, that's the challenge.
Thank you. Josh, there was a specific question for you, whether you were going to liquefy the hydrogen produced to transport it.
Yes, for the first plant, yes. For the second plant, no. Different markets for vehicle filling stations, they prefer it liquid. For the second plant, part of that will be injected into the natural gas grid, so gaseous.
So maybe, Gary, I can turn to you, because, I mean, you mentioned the Department of Energy plans, in particular the hub plans. So, I mean, is there anything you want to add about, which relates to what Josh and Marina have mentioned in terms of the need to basically transport this hydrogen to the end user market?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I have heard is over the near term in places like California, in Josh's backyard, there's been some interest in blending hydrogen into the natural gas grid. I think some local utility companies are investigating blends perhaps up to 5% hydrogen. So I know that's one vector to get carbon negative hydrogen kind of to end users. But when you're thinking about, like a refiner or a chemical company that would require, a more pure hydrogen stream, that sort of approach obviously would leave something to be desired. I did want to comment briefly a little bit on, end use of the hydrogen. In my communications with, industry members in the United States, I think there's a huge appetite for decarbonizing processes where possible. We talk a lot domestically about the quote unquote difficult to decarbonize sectors. So one thing that I've seen that's particularly interesting is, when we think about sustainable aviation fuels from, oils and greases and biomass, they typically require a lot of hydro treating to get rid of residual oxygen and other impurities, things like that. If you were able to blend carbon negative hydrogen during like hydro treating steps of these sustainable fuels, some of our preliminary analysis suggests you might be able to reach carbon negative, sort of like aviation fuels. So that's one in case in particular that I think is quite interesting.
Thank you. We haven't talked too much about the cost. Maybe as a final question, maybe Gary, I start with you. I don't know whether you have seen a lot of cost estimates. We did a little bit of analysis on that, which gives us a very wide range, but I'm quite curious what you see on your end. And then turning to Marina.
Yeah, I'll give you the cop-out answer of it. Really depends on the assumptions. As Josh touched on earlier, where's the CO2 sequestration site located? What type of feedstock are you using? So, just to give you a rough number, I've seen estimates all the way from, as low as, around $2 per kilogram, all the way up to $8 or $10, depending on the process and the assumption. But one thing I wanted to add just real quickly before we run out of time that's related to that topic is, we've talked a lot today about biogas upgrading, biomass upgrading to get to carbon negative hydrogen. And those are absolutely, great near-term high TRL technologies, but there's a whole myriad of other technologies out there like seawater electrolysis, electro-oxidation of wastewaters, plasma reforming of like CO2 and water. There's a lot of ways that we might be able to get to carbon negative hydrogen, but to your earlier question, it comes at right now at a higher cost given the low TRL. So it really spans the gamut, is the answer.
Yeah. And there might be also an interest to push towards, technologies which are already mature, because we need to start scaling up hydrogen immediately. Marina, have you also done some analysis on these costs? Do you see, we have seen the same kind of range of costs, but I'm just curious on the European side, whether you have seen something slightly different.
Yeah, we try to gather this information between our members. It's not easy because the majority of the technologies are really low TRL. But then you have the biomethane or biogas reforming, and those are actually, at least one of our members is already producing it because it's convenient. It's located in Südtirol, which is Italy, Austria, this part. And there it's convenient and it's the same, a competitive price in comparison with biogas. But in the paper, we adapted from the paper of the Columbia University, and the cost, depending on the technology, it's around almost €2 to €10 per kilogram of hydrogen. And that's from biohydrogen production. And that's the numbers we have. Yeah.
That's a very wide range indeed.
It is.
Well, thank you very much. There are a lot of questions. I'm afraid that we are running a little bit out of time. I've tried to answer as many as possible. I would very much like to thank our panelists for their excellent answers to all the questions or to as many questions that we could answer. As mentioned, there will be a recording of that webinar available in a few days on our website. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that tomorrow we are going to have another webinar, this time on natural gas, with the IEA presenting their new medium-term gas market outlook. So this is going to be at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. You can also find a full list of all our events on our website. So again, thanks to Gary, Marina, and Josh for this really very interesting webinar. I hope the about 250 people who have joined us today really enjoyed that, and those who have registered will eventually look at the presentation. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good day and enjoyable evening or afternoon wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Bye-bye.